This is the Solid Signal Podcast for the week of March 2nd, 2020. You know, the subject of this week's podcast is, it might just work. And there's something really powerful about those words, it might just work. That's what underlies the spirit of DIY-ness that really drives a lot of Solid Signal customers. And it's really kind of a neat thing, it might just work. To think of something that uses the parts that you have or have available and could actually solve your problem with a minimum of cost or even a minimum of effort usually ends up being worth it. Sometimes it's a maximum effort and it still ends up being worth it. But there's also something a little bit concerning about it might just work. Because it might just work also means it might just work for now and then might not work later. And so it comes down to the individual DIYer to try to decide whether it might just work is the right option for any particular moment. I'm reminded of this because I was reading a comment on the Solid Signal blog, blog.solidsignal.com, that was talking about how you could potentially use copper-coated steel coaxial cable to carry current, because the amount of current that you're carrying in most cases is actually pretty minor and the distances aren't really that long, so the amount of loss isn't that much and it might just work. And this is true. I know actually people who are using copper-clad steel for carrying current and it does work for them and they're not experiencing any problems. And it's true also that they might not even experience fewer problems if they had gone ahead and used solid copper. In this case, it does work. But there are cases where you really have to ask yourself if it might just work is really the right answer. I find that, for example, if you're talking about carrying any sort of electricity, it might just work isn't a really confidence-building answer. It might just work also means it just might spectacularly fail. And that's the last thing that you want to deal with electricity. Electricity, friends, is a fairly dangerous thing which can burn down your house, even if a small amount of it doesn't go where it should. Of course, we have fuses and circuit breakers and all sorts of protections to make sure this sort of doesn't happen, but it doesn't mean you should go ahead and be super risky when it comes to electricity. There's also things like it might just work, like combining splitters. There are a whole bunch of things when you're talking about satellite that don't make sense when using splitters. It used to be pretty easy because every splitter was always going to just cut the amount of signal that you had in half. Use a two-way splitter, well, half the signal goes to each port. Use a four-way splitter, a quarter of the signal goes to each port. Use an eight-way splitter, an eighth of the signal goes to each port. Split it enough and you don't have enough signal to overcome the noise floor, and therefore you have problems. But with today's modern satellite systems, it's a little harder to understand because modern satellite systems like the DirecTV Genie system and the Hopper system, instead of having all of the signals going back and forth to a single multi-switch, sometimes they just jump from port to port. Matter of fact, this is more and more common. Think of a Genie system, for example. You've got a Genie DVR on one leg of a splitter, and on the other three legs of the splitters, you have three Genie clients. Those three clients are not sending signal back to the multi-switch at all. They're communicating with the Genie client by hopping from port to port. And therefore, you actually lose a lot more signal when communicating from port to port than you would communicating from client to straight to the multi-switch. Typical port isolation losses around 13 dB, which isn't as much of a problem as you think because the Genie signal is very, very strong compared to a satellite signal, and so the amount of loss that you get is totally factored in. There's no reason to think that you'd want to change the way that you wire things, and especially remember that the port-to-port isolation applies whether or not you're looking at the input port or one of the side ports, so it's not like there's any difference there. The same, by the way, is true of the Hopper system, where the Joeys don't communicate with the dish at all. They get as far as the node, and the node sends that traffic straight to the Hopper itself. So this gets to be a little bit more confusing in your use of splitters. It means that in a Genie system, for example, that an 8-way splitter definitely beats out two 4-way splitters, because in the case of two 4-way splitters, you're going out one port of one splitter, in one port of another splitter, and then out to the client. And that means you have increased port-to-port loss far more than you would with a single 8-way splitter, which has the same port-to-port loss as a 4-way splitter. And that's another thing that tends to not make sense for people. Because we're talking about jumping from port to port, it doesn't matter if you're on a 2-port, an 8-port, a 4-port. Even if there were a mythical 16-port, the amount of port-to-port isolation would be the same. So using 5 or 6 different splitters to get from your Genie to your client just might work, or it just might not. A lot of people in the early days of the Genie and the Hopper complained that these were unreliable systems, and that's not really true. What's true is that people weren't using them the way that they were intended to be used. They were using wiring schemes that didn't make as much sense. And, for its part, DirecTV, AT&T, Dish didn't necessarily make this super clear to DIYers what needed to be done. And it took years before we really began to understand the way that should work. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's up to each one of you as a DIYer to really understand what it just might work really means to you and what you're willing to put up with. I know that if it were just me, for example, I'd be willing to put up with an incredibly flaky system to get the most performance I possibly could. I'd be willing to rewire stuff and unplug stuff and whatever, just so that I could be out there on the bleeding edge. But my family is far less supportive of that sort of thing than I am, and I take that into account. I hope you do too. I hope that when you shop at solidsignal.com for the things that you need, that you're not just looking to be on the bleeding edge if that doesn't make sense to you, but instead hoping to create a system that makes everybody in your household happy. And I know with the stuff that you'll find at solidsignal.com that you'll be able to do that. That's it for the podcast for this week. Go ahead if you can and like and subscribe. I know that I've asked this every single time recently, but please do like the podcast, subscribe to it, like the other videos that are out here, because this is the kind of thing that keeps me going, keeps me looking good to my bosses, and I do appreciate everyone else who has done it. Thanks, and I will see you next week.